I'm delighted to be here. Leslie has been asking me about coming to Paris to do this talk for a couple of years, so it's always wonderful to come to Paris, and it is especially wonderful to have a chance to meet those of you working in this field. The talk is titled, like the book that Leslie just mentioned, The Flat World in Education, after Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, which talked about globalization and how that's influencing all of us. And so I asked the question, what is the influence or the implication of this flat world for education, after I had a conversation with Tom, and he said, I know it's about education, but I'm not exactly sure, what it means. I wrote this actually while I was heading Barack Obama's transition team, policy transition team, back in 2008, and I wrote it for him, and I gave him the only hard copy my publisher gave me, he got, and he promised to read it, and I said I would give him a test, and it would not be multiple choice. So we're still working on his performance assessment. But I want to take up these issues that I took up in the book about the issues of inequality, about the nature of reform, and there's already been allusion to the fact that there are all kinds of reforms that are being propounded by governments around the world, not only the United States. Everyone is engaged in reform because education is becoming more important for individuals and society, and because there are a lot of competing ideas about how to improve the quality and the equity of education systems. I want to start with America's own history around inequality, which is deeply rooted in a period of enslavement of African Americans, of denial of educational opportunities to not only enslaved African Americans and others, but Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and so on, but also the power of education to move people forward and its necessity for liberation. This happens to be from the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and he tells this little story about becoming literate. He said, I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. And this is a microscopic example of the macro issues that we deal with in societies all over the world. One of the best ways to oppress people is to keep them from becoming well-educated. And the only way, really, in today's society to become liberated is to take the inch and turn it into the L, to really achieve access to higher education. And while this was 80 or something when he wrote this, we're still struggling with these issues today. A changing economy all around the world makes education even more important for survival and for success. In 1900, the U.S. public school system was being formulated in the way that it exists today during the Industrial Revolution. 5% of jobs required specialized knowledge and skills. By 2000, 70% of jobs required specialized knowledge and skills beyond high school. It's even higher than that today. So we're at a point where we have to educate most people for the level of knowledge and skill that we used to educate only a very small proportion. We used to cream off a few students for thinking work. They were in higher tracks, advanced placement courses, honors courses. That level of education is now needed by most students. There are a lot of things going on to articulate the need to raise standards, et cetera, around that. The other thing that is important to understand is that the nature of skills being demanded by the economy is changing. This, again, is from the U.S., but it's not unlike what's happening in many other countries. The demand for non-routine, interactive, and analytic skills is going way up. The demand for routine, manual, cognitive skills is going way down. And so the nature of what people need to know, that is, they have to be able to use judgment. They have to be able to monitor their own work. They've got to be able to inquire, investigate, access resources, make sense of them. They just can't do what somebody tells them to do in an assembly line. And so the dilemma, and this is actually a note from Andreas Schleicher of OECD, this little blurb: the skills that are easiest to teach and to test are also the ones that are the easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. And that's a worldwide dilemma, not just in the United States. Yet in many nations right now, despite the growing demand for education, budget cuts are hitting education very, very hard. And I don't know if you can see the slide, but it basically says, I'll try not to hit anything vital, as our poor little student up there. So these are just slides from countries around the world where hundreds of thousands of people, especially students, have turned out to protest budget cuts in education. So this is in Barcelona. All of this within the last year. This is in England. All I want for Christmas is an education. In New Zealand, what are your priorities? In the United States, why is there always money for war and not education? And in California, which some people consider part of the United States, but those of us from California consider it its own country, save our schools. The budget cuts in California have cut out of a state that now is spending well below the average in the United States. We've lost $2,000 per pupil in expenditures in the last 2 years, and we are facing another $400 a pupil cut in November if we don't pass a levy, which will put us below almost every state but Mississippi or Louisiana. And this used to be the great state of California, which was known as the Golden State for being the education leader in the United States. In the United States today, people talk about two achievement gaps. They talk about always the gap between white and more affluent students and students of color and those in poverty. Every September, the test scores come out. Every September, there's an achievement gap. People go, oh my goodness, there's an achievement gap, and it starts another round of dialogue about that topic. Rarely does it start the kind of action that would actually reduce the achievement gap, but the dialogue is robust and long-lasting. And then there is a gap between U.S. students and those in other higher achieving countries that have made greater and more equitable investments in education over the last 30 years. And that gap is getting increasing attention in the United States. And it is used in the political and policy discourse as a reason for reforms of all kinds. So whatever the reform is that you favor, this would be the reason to do it. It is true that the U.S. is falling behind in educational attainment. And these next couple of slides I'm also indebted to OECD for, so I will want to credit that. The black, yellow, and red bars are the advances made in countries since the 1970s. So you can see that in a lot of countries there's been a great gain in achieving high school level qualifications over the last couple of decades, whereas in the United States there's been almost no change at all since about 1970, and you can see that we were first in the world in high school qualifications at that time, and now as of about 2000 we were 13th. South Korea was 27th. They're now first with over 90% of students graduating. It is not uncommon now for countries in the world to have more than 90% of students graduating. There are quite a number of countries in that club where high school graduation is expected pretty routinely. And in South Korea, about 80% of those young people go on to higher education of some sort, and most of them finish. And so the gaps are increasing across societies. And I just make a note, in South Korea after the Korean War, only 15% of school buildings were left standing. Only about 10% of the population was getting a high school education. So in that period of about 50 years, this is a country that just said we're about to rebuild an education system and ensure that everyone gets a level of education. College participation rates in the U.S. are also falling behind. We, for years and years, were first in the world in higher education participation. It was taken for granted that many thought it was the best higher education system in the world and the most open. We're now at 17th and dropping a little bit more every year. That's especially because financial aid for college has been greatly decreased. Back in the 1960s and 70s, you could get most of a college education paid for through the combination of federal loans and other financial aid. If you could get in, you would have your college paid for. For young people today, that is not at all the case. Federal financial aid might cover a third of the cost of a public higher education, as public higher education is being disinvested in and tuition is going up there, it's covering less and less. So people who have earned the right to go to college are not going to college. In California, 50,000 young people who had met every standard. They have a set of courses and grade level and test score cutoffs. 50,000 people who had met all of those standards could not go to college in California because of the cutbacks. About 38% of U.S. students and about 28% of California students earn a college degree as compared to roughly about 50% in many European nations and as much as 60% in some nations like South Korea and Singapore. And that, of course, is related to long-term economic growth as well. And then we look at the achievement outcomes. Now, this is a slide that I know people feel differently about the uses of the Pisa assessments for identifying the ranking of countries. But I want to show something about this. This is 2009 data. You see the top three highly ranked nations on reading, math, and science include Korea, Finland, and Singapore. Japan pops up. You see Canada, New Zealand. Some of these countries seem to do well routinely. The U.S. is 14th in reading, 27th in math, 21st in science. And in the U.S., these data are translated as we are falling behind, we're way below the average, our schools are falling apart, public education doesn't work. There's a whole discourse that goes along with these data. And then that discourse is followed by, and here's the reform that we ought to follow, and that depends on who you talk to as what the reform might be that you would be urged to take on. But in fact, inequality is really at the root of the lower rankings. This basically shows you that compared to the OECD average, white and Asian students score above the OECD average on every subject, and African American and Latino students score significantly below. And so the real issue here is an equity issue in access to education. The other issue here, which is rarely in the political discourse, is the high and growing poverty rate of individuals, families, and children in the United States. The red bar is the U.S. It's the poverty rates of PISA participants. This is at about 22%, but today childhood poverty is at about 25%. About 1 in 4 children in the United States lives in poverty, and it's a very low poverty line. In addition to that, there's this tattered safety net. So whereas in many countries, if you live in poverty, there will still be ways for families to get housing, for children to get health care, for food security to be met. That is no longer the case in the United States. There's growing homelessness as well as a function of a number of policies. In a number of districts near where I live, more than 1 in 10 children is homeless. And so that's kind of becoming a norm in education of children in high poverty communities. Now, if you look at the U.S. PISA results by school poverty, you see something very different. So those schools where less than 10% of children live in poverty would actually outscore every country in the world in reading. And those where even 10 to 25% of kids are in poverty would score in the top 3. And even schools where up to 50% of kids live in poverty would score above the international average. And if you're wondering where France is, it's the purple bar right there. And what you see here is schools where more than 50% or even more than 75% of kids live in poverty score very, very low. And my point about this is that the problem with the U.S. education system is not that the entire system is failing. What's remarkable, if you go back to what other countries deal with in terms of poverty rates, very few have a poverty rate even as high as 10%. Almost all of these countries, including all of those who rank highly on PISA, have fewer than 10% of their kids living in poverty. So those are the countries. If we supported our children, we would be comparing well to other countries that support their children. And that's at the root of part of the educational conversation that's not being had primarily in the United States. In addition to the differences in success rates of children in different schools, school spending is unequal. in the United States across states. So if you live in Vermont, you're going to have 3 times as much spent on your kids as if you live in Utah. Even if you adjust it for cost of living differentials, there are huge differentials. Spending is unequal within states. So if you live in California in a wealthy district, you will spend as much as 4 times as much as if you live in a poor district, and the same thing would be true in New York. And so the anatomy of inequality in the United States is this high rate of poverty, growing segregation. In fact, we are more segregated now than we were 30 years ago. Because resegregation has been occurring since the 1980s. Unequal school funding on top of that. More money to the children of the rich, less money to the children of the poor. That leads to inequitable distribution of well-qualified educators because salaries are different, working conditions are different. There's not actually an overall shortage of teachers, but there is a shortage of teachers willing to work for low wages under bad working conditions. That related to unequal access to curriculum, and then at the sort of the top of the pyramid you get some dysfunctional schools. So we have some of the best schools in the world in the United States, and in fact some of the most innovative work continues to go on in the US. People come from all over the world to study the innovations, and as my friends in Singapore always tell me, we come, we see, we take back, we scale up. So whereas in the US, innovations are started and planted. We are very innovative. Teachers have created great programs, principals. There are all kinds of wonderful, exciting things going to go on. But after a while, the foundations or whoever helped fund it said, well, we're moving on to something else. A new superintendent comes in, the school board changes, and the innovation goes away. So we are actually at a point where we may innovate our way to failure because we don't have a sensibility about building the systems that would allow good education and programs to survive, take root, last, and spread to others. And then we allow this extraordinary inequality so that there are schools with 3 swimming pools and multiple football fields and foreign language classes from elementary to high school, and there are schools that are literally falling down, literally do not have textbooks for students, do not have qualified teachers for students, do not have the basics that you would need to operate an educational system. We are moving backwards after we moved forwards. In the 1960s, we had a war on poverty. We had the Great Society programs. They really did reduce poverty. Poverty was a little more than half then what it is today. We've almost doubled the rate of childhood poverty since these programs were eliminated in the 1980s. We had reduced unemployment, segregation. Teacher shortages were eliminated with a variety of teacher investment programs. Most of this was done away with in the 80s. There was a huge reduction of the achievement gap between the 1960s and the 1980s. 2/3 of the difference was eliminated. Had we stayed on track with those policies, we would have had no racial achievement gap by the year 2000. But almost all of those policies were pulled out by the roots in the 1980s. And we have been struggling. The achievement gap widened again. All of these problems returned, and we've been struggling to kind of get back on top of this since then. So Brown versus Board of Education is, of course, the seminal school desegregation lawsuit that occurred in the United States. And that was really around racial differences in access to education. 50 plus years after Brown, we're really looking at the differences between rich and poor children and districts. Segregation, however, does support inequality. 2/3 of Black and Latino students now attend predominantly minority schools. And even in integrated schools, you have a tracking system where minority students are typically in the bottom track. So what kind of policies could help? I'm an old English teacher myself, so I like English teacher cartoons. This one says, "No child left behind. Today you're going to learn the meaning of irony." How many of you know about No Child Left Behind? Okay, pretty good. This was the major education reform of the beginning of the Bush administration. In about the year 2001, it actually took effect in 2002. It's a noble policy goal to reduce achievement gaps and to support achievement for all students. The strategy was to set targets was to require every student to be tested every year in grades 3 through 8 plus 11, and then to set targets for schools to advance in average school scores each year. If targets were not met, very complicated formula, you might have to meet 30 different targets. If all of your targets were not met each year, you would be put in something called program improvement. That would require the use of some of the funds for outside tutors. It would require being willing to transfer students and bus them to other schools that they might choose. And ultimately, it could require the school to be discontinued. All kinds of improvement plans, and then discontinuation could be at the end of that process. The law also demanded highly qualified teachers, but it put in place some policies that actually increased something called alternative certification, which allowed teachers to be hired before they were prepared. There was a demand for higher achievement, but what we've learned in research over the last 10 years is that we created a set of incentives that were not intended. One set of incentives are for excluding low-scoring students, because the way you get your average scores up is to have the right students in your school. A big narrowing of curriculum. American schools are teaching much less social studies and science than they used to. Arts and music and PE in many places have been discontinued entirely. And we've lost teachers from high-need schools because it's not pleasant to teach in places that are labeled as failing and where there are a set of sanctions and punishments that follow. This is typical of the kind of situation you would see with rewards and sanctions. U.S. accountability plans now really tend to focus on setting goals, attaching rewards to meeting the goals, and sanctions to failing to meet the goals. Imagine this is a little tiny school. Its average score went from 70 to 74. The percent of kids meeting the standards went from 66% to 80%. Would you give this school rewards or sanctions? If you were a U.S. policymaker, you would give them rewards. Is there anybody here who would give them sanctions? Why? Right. So every one of these scores went down. Every kid did less well, but we got rid of Francisco. And this is happening on a huge level with tens of thousands of kids being pushed out of schools in order to get the scores up. We've published a number of papers looking at what happens to kids in under high-stakes accountability systems. So that's one unintended outcome of the test-based accountability policies. Another policy was to expand alternative routes to certification, which is ways for teachers to come in before they are prepared. Those tend to operate only in high minority, low-income districts and only in the highest minority, low-income schools within those districts. Race to the Top, which is another recent policy, encourage districts or states not only to expand those routes to teaching, but to reduce the amount of preparation coursework that teachers would have. This is a study by Mathematica, a research organization, and these are the gain scores of students whose teachers had what were called the low coursework alternative certification routes, the very little preparation and no student teaching. Those kids actually went down in their reading and math scores from fall to spring. Those who had teachers from what were called high coursework alternative routes, where they got all the same coursework, but they did it in a different way over a different period of time, went up. Those who had traditionally prepared teachers went up a little further. The evidence about the strategy of reducing preparation as a strategy for improving outcomes does not work, based on most of the evidence. The outcomes of No Child Left Behind are that state scores have gone up. In any state of the union, you will hear people talking about our scores are going up, and they are. But national gains have slowed down, and in fact, we've dropped achievement in reading, in 8th grade reading. So what's going on at the state level isn't being picked up at the national assessments, which are not tied to high stakes, which are sort of a population sample test. And on international tests, in some cases our scores have dropped, in others they've stayed the same. Graduation rates have declined in some states, student exclusions have increased, teacher attrition has gone. Right now we have a set of strategies that I would argue goes straight to the periphery of the issues. The strategy of reducing preparation for teachers and firing low performers is a major piece of policy. And while there may be some good argument for spending attention on teacher evaluation, there certainly is, and we certainly need ways to reduce, to eliminate teachers who cannot improve and be sure that they can move on to a better career. If we are doing only that without building a profession, without preparing people on the front end and having an adequate supply of good people coming in, that's not going to, at the end of the day, improve the overall system. Another popular reform is merit pay. Merit pay has come and gone in the United States in the 1900s, the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1980s, and now we've got it again. The idea of tying teacher bonuses of some sort to either test scores or evaluations in some fashion. It has never lasted long, and several big studies have found that it did not improve achievement. And again, there may be places where compensating teachers in innovative ways, especially tied to them being able to use their expertise to help other teachers get better, would be a good idea. And you could see forms of innovative compensation or merit pay that could work. But the simplistic approaches that we keep revisiting are not going to get us very far, especially without competitive, equitable salaries and working conditions to begin with, because the places where we have shortages, it's because the basic salaries may be half as much in a high-need urban district like Oakland than they are in a wealthy district 5 miles away that serves much more easy-to-teach children. The third strategy that really has been used a lot in the last years is managing schools pretty much exclusively by test scores. You know that you'll get rewarded and punished based on test score gains or losses. But that has been, in many cases, done without any attention to school completion, getting kids through school. So you get rewarded for getting rid of kids before they graduate if they make your scores go up, without attention to addressing the causes of poverty or other purposes of education, including, growing citizens, growing people who are socially responsible, having people who are well-rounded individuals who know things besides basic reading and math, and who can do things beyond bubbling in on multiple choice tests. Because in the United States, almost all of the testing, which is now very extensive, is multiple choice testing, whereas in many other countries in the world, tests, in France, essay examinations, le baccalauréat. In England, open-ended examinations with project components. In Singapore, also open-ended examinations with project components. You have to design and conduct science investigations, and teachers score those. So kids are actually engaged in inquiry and thinking and problem solving and managing resources and information. And in the United States, they are bubbling in. The fourth area that's been pursued is targets and sanctions, and now we have policies that encourage closing schools who are low achieving without putting in resources for capacity building. So you've got schools that are under-resourced serving very high-need children who are becoming more and more poor. They score low, and if we blow them up, we can create other schools, and we're now in our second generation of schools that are getting blown up for a second time and replaced with other schools serving the same high-need kids in the same under-resourced districts, which have even fewer resources than they had previously, without actually solving the fundamental problem of the capacity of communities and the capacity of schools to help children learn. And then our last innovation is requiring states to expand charter schools, and in some cases to replace traditionally district-run public schools with charter schools. And again, there are some wonderful charter schools. I happen to have been involved in founding a charter school. I work with a lot of charter schools. But the evidence about charter schools in the United States shows that they're more likely on average to underperform other public schools serving similar students than they are to outperform similar schools, other public schools serving similar students. And there's a lot of issues around access because they enroll fewer special education students, fewer English language learners. So we have this question about the diversification of the public school sector, which is not addressing frontally and fundamentally the equity questions that are at the root of a lot of our issues. So what are the alternatives? I'd like to just start with a quote from a colleague of mine, Adam Urbanski, who is the president of the Rochester Federation of Teachers. And he just, I think, nailed something that is very important for us to think about. Because in many societies, the idea of excellence and the idea of equity are framed as though they are in opposition to each other. You can have excellence or you can have equity. And he put it this way: excellence and equity are not opposing concepts. The definitions of the words include each other. Excellence without equity is simply not excellence, it is privilege. Excellence is superlative performance starting from a level playing field, performance made superlative through extraordinary effort and talent, not from the relative advantage of some at the expense of others. True excellence requires equity as a precondition. And he went on to say, and equity without excellence is not equity, it is tokenism, and leads to a mediocrity that is good for no one's kids. Equity means we push every one of our students to excellence and tell them in no uncertain terms, we will support you along the way, no matter who your parents are, where they may have been born, the color of your skin, where you live, how much money your parents make, the structure of your family, your prior academic performance, or even how long you have been in the district. You are ours, and we will support you. And the fundamental idea that all of the children are ours is the idea that I think societies have to grapple with. When education is conceptualized as a private good, I got mine, see if you can get yours. If you can't, sorry for you, it doesn't affect me. It really doesn't work in today's societies because we're all identified with one another. So in the United States, I'm a member of the baby boom generation, and I think some of you might join me in that. And so our health care, our Social Security for this enormous graying generation is entirely dependent on whether every one of the young people in the economy can get a good job that pays good wages and they can pay taxes. We're now at a point where the U.S. Is number one in one thing, which is incarceration rates. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's inmates. We have more people in prison than all of China. Not proportionately, absolutely. And that's because 80% of the people who are incarcerated are high school dropouts. Most of them are functionally illiterate. If you can't get an education, you cannot survive in the economy. So in California, we are paying $50,000 a year on young men, primarily, who we wouldn't spend $10,000 a year on to get them educated. And then we'll spend 5 times as much. We've grown that sector by 400%. And now, in many states, including California, we're spending more on prisons and corrections than we are on the entire public higher education system. So education and prisons are competing for the dollars that are needed. So it matters to me. And, even if I were not morally driven or had any notion of democracy and the welfare of the society intellectually, I have to care that every child gets a good education because I can't get my retirement and my Social Security and my health care benefits unless every one of them is working to pay for it. And this is, we would like societies to be motivated by what's right and what's appropriate for the welfare and the potential of every human. But if societies do not understand their own self-interest and the fact that you are ours, every child is ours, and we must support you, those societies will fail. And the United States is really at the brink of either figuring this out and making a radical U-turn in its education policies, or entering into a decline that will probably replicate the fall of Rome. So what are the highest achieving nations doing? If you look across those, and in the book that Leslie mentioned, I look across countries in the world and I look specifically at nations that have gone from being low achieving and inequitable to high achieving and equitable in their educational outcomes. They support children, number one. They make sure that children have health care, housing, food security, and early childhood education. They spend the same amount on all schools. They spend the money equitably, and they put more money in high-need schools and students. They make huge investments in initial teacher education and support. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. They design schools to support teacher and student learning. There's a lot of learning time for teachers to get better and better at what they do. And then they provide equitable access to what I call a thinking curriculum. It's not a basic skills, bubble in multiple choice curriculum. It's a curriculum that's aimed at these 21st century skills that are going to make a difference in how people perform. And let me just give you one example that's very vivid for me. As I said, in U.S. schools, a lot of schools have eliminated science and social studies. Where they have them, they're often driven by the tests, which are memorize a lot of information and regurgitate on the test. Anybody here from New York? There's always somebody from New York. Remember the New York Regents exam in biology. So when I was in Singapore, where the goal is to become a science and technology leader in the world, and kids are taking science and engaging in technology work, it's all about investigation, inquiry, experimentation. So at every grade level, kids will come up to you and say, let me tell you about my most recent science experiment. They might pop open a little PowerPoint to demonstrate. And we asked this question, and we designed this experiment, and here's our data, and we analyzed the data, and it shows this, and I proved this hypothesis, and here's my next question that I'm wondering around. And it's like a continuous part of the curriculum. So I think this idea of a rich thinking curriculum, you would see these same kinds of experiments in the assessment and curriculum systems in many, many other countries is part of the question. And then, as I said, performance or assessments on higher order skills. Back to the point that Leslie made, another piece of the solution is this teacher quality question. Teaching diverse kids for high levels of learning is much more difficult than the teaching we expected of teachers 30, 40, 50 years ago, which was to get through the book, cover the curriculum, just offer the education. And if some kids get it, good, they're smart. If other kids don't get it, we call them dumb, we track them, etc. That's the end of the story. That is not what teachers are being asked to do today. They're asked to make every child learn, regardless of what they come with and what their experience is and so on. Highly sophisticated strategies. Great teachers are great artists, and they're working with a very deep scientific knowledge base. We've had a lot of studies in the U.S. One of the benefits of all of our testing is that we can always look at what are the things that are related to high test scores. So we have a lot of studies like these that look at student achievement. And they've found that teachers are significantly more effective in increasing students' learning if they're fully prepared when they enter teaching rather than entering through an unlicensed route, which is a very large number of American teachers now. That they're more experienced, and especially beyond the third or fourth year of experience, you see dramatic differences. They're certified in the specific field that they teach, that is, they know the subject and know how to teach that subject. They're well prepared academically. They did well, went to a good college, and got a high GPA and did well on, academic measures. And in North Carolina, they looked at national board certification, which are teachers who are able to demonstrate through videotapes and portfolios of their practice how well they teach. The effects on student achievement of having a teacher with most of these qualifications, which an advantaged kid in the United States is likely to have, as compared to having one with few of those qualifications, which would describe many of the teachers in inner city and low-income communities, were greater than the effects of race and parent education combined. So we think of a lot of the achievement gap as being driven by race, income, parent education. And income continues to be a major differentiator. But having very well-prepared teachers, if we had very well-prepared teachers in every classroom, it would substantially reduce the effects that we otherwise see of these differentials. And in high-achieving countries, many of them actually do try to be sure all their teachers meet these qualifications. They're all high-achieving academically, brought into good preparation programs, kept in throughout the career, so they become very, very experienced, and teaching in the field for which they are prepared. If you were to become a teacher in Finland, Singapore, Korea, you would come in, you would be selected from the highest achieving members of the high school or college class. You would have, depending on the country, anywhere from 2 to 4 years of preparation to teach, completely paid for by the government, with a salary or a stipend while you train. You would then go into a school and get mentoring that is established from very well-trained and well-qualified mentors who are there to be sure that you learn to teach effectively. And then you would have, in most cases, 15 to 25 hours a week to plan with your fellow teachers, to do action research, lesson study, to learn to make sure that all of your lessons are high-quality lessons. If you're a U.S. teacher, you will get almost no support to go into teaching financially. You will have to go into debt to go into an occupation that pays 60% of what other college graduates earn, whereas again in other countries it's more equivalent to other college graduates. You will come into a field where you might get a little help when you enter or you might not. It's kind of variable. And you will have 3 hours a week for individual planning in most schools and no time to work with your colleagues to improve your craft. So the differentials in the ways in which teaching is supported are very different. What are the higher achieving and more equitable nations not doing? They're not doing several things that the U.S. is doing right now. They're not cutting funds to schools and colleges. They're not privatizing education. Basically everyone goes to public schools in Finland. Singapore, that's a new nation. It's the highest achieving of all. In Singapore, there are private schools, but they are not considered the best schools. The elites send their kids to public schools because those are where the highest quality education goes on. They're not ranking and labeling schools and teachers. They are not allocating rewards and sanctions based on test scores. And they're certainly not de-professionalizing teaching and saying, y'all come in and we'll just fire you if you don't succeed. There are some questions I'm ending here now that I would suggest that we could ask about education reforms around the world, including in the U.S., but elsewhere as well. Around standards, curriculum, and testing, we should ask whether standards and curriculum emphasize higher order thinking and performance or superficial coverage of content, the bubbling in phenomenon. We should ask whether tests ask students to apply their learning to genuine problems and communicate their thinking, or merely to recall or recognize memorized content. And just to make one other point about how the world is moving ahead, OECD's Pisa's assessment will have collaborative problem solving as an assessment in the next few years. This is like a whole other area of getting kids ready for the 21st century skills. That will be very challenging for a lot of kids in the United States who don't get much chance to engage in deep problem solving. Teachers and teaching, do policies help educators develop and share their expertise in a sophisticated way, or do they foster low skills, high turnover, isolation, and remote control of teaching? I'll mention just one now international reform, which in the United States was Teach for America. It's now Teach for South Africa, Teach for England, Teach for, in any country where there is strong inequality, there's a receptive field for bring people in who don't have preparation to teach and only keep them for 2 years. Let them cycle through as sort of a missionary work. We just had another of many studies pointing out that when you promulgate high turnover, you substantially reduce the achievement of kids in those high turnover schools. And that also promotes something that I call the remote control of teaching. If people don't know much when they come into teaching, then we need to control them with scripted curriculum, tightly managed instruction, testing regimes, rather than trusting that they could individualize and create a student-centered curriculum. Finally, accountability and improvement. Do policies foster professional responsibility and professional accountability, or do they actually foster gaming and competition, which we've seen in the test-based regime in the United States? The number of articles about cheating on the tests, around pushing out the low-performing students, around the kids who have the highest needs being hot potatoes. They're kind of treated like lepers. Nobody wants them. Keep them out. Try to get rid of them. That's not, in a sense, genuine accountability. So what do we need? To ensure equity and excellence, I would argue that we need an agenda that really focuses us on equitable and adequate resources. In the U.S., there are 40-some states that have school finance reform lawsuits. that are trying to get adequate and equitable resources ordered by the courts. Some of them have been successful, but it's now as though every state has its state bird, its state flag, and its state school finance lawsuit. And that's a very torturous way to get to equity, but it is the way that is being pursued. You need strong professional standards and supports. You need to be able to say this is what teachers need to know, and then ensure that they get high quality preparation to get that kind of knowledge and skills. We could talk more about how that can happen, but there are ways to leverage, and we have some spectacular preparation programs in the U.S., but almost no incentives for other programs to adopt the strategies that are being used in the best. You need meaningful learning goals. You need to be focused on stuff that's really going to count for kids when they get into jobs and when they get into higher education, and it needs to be this basket of 21st century skills that they are going to have to use. They're going to be solving problems that we can't imagine yet, based on information that hasn't been invented yet, using technologies that we don't know anything about yet. And if they don't have the capacity to learn, they're not going to be able to handle that. We need what the Finns call intelligent accountability systems. For them, they do no external testing, but they do a lot of evaluation. And so there's an evaluation inquiry cycle that goes on for teachers, for schools, for the system as a whole, and that expects a lot and reinforces high quality practice, but does it in a way that is intelligent and reciprocal. And we need schools designed for empowering forms of student and teacher learning. Teachers need to learn along with students. And then we need to really deal with this poverty issue with the kinds of things that can make a huge difference. There's one final study I'll mention to you that Johns Hopkins did, which looked at the difference between rich and poor kids at 9th grade and said what accounts for the difference in achievement. A third of it was present at kindergarten. The differences in what kids got access to before they got to school. 2/3 of it was caused by summer learning loss. Because rich kids go to wonderful camps and gain in achievement all summer, or they read and read and read. And low-income kids typically lose achievement in the summer. And now that we no longer have summer programs that we used to have in the 60s and 70s, there's very little for them to do. So basically, schools are about the same rate during the school year. In fact, low-income kids improve a little bit more than rich kids. But you have a gap at the beginning, and every summer it gets bigger. So we need preschool, we need summer learning, and we need wraparound services. These are all things that were planted in the American education policy landscape in the 1970s, and that have not been tended in recent years to expand and to grow, except in a few places. But I'm going to tell you about New Jersey. Anybody here from Jersey? And you took the New York regions.
Well, I taught New York.
Yeah, so you know about them. Yeah. So for most of us, New Jersey is I-95 between New York and Philadelphia. And Bruce Springsteen. Yeah, what else is Jersey? It's Jersey Girls. You know, you can think about all of your Jersey reference. But New Jersey is now, believe this or not, New Jersey is the highest achieving state in the United States in writing. And it's second in reading, and it's one of the top 5 in everything else. It is 45% students of color. It is more than 1/3 kids in poverty. And they closed their achievement gap by more than half because they equalized school funding in 1998. They brought the low spending, high minority districts, Trenton, Newark, Camden, up to the level of spending. After this was 30 years of lawsuits and 9 court decisions, they brought them up to the level of spending of the high spending districts. They put in place preschool for all low-income kids in a very high-quality way with well-trained teachers. They put in place teacher education and professional development programs, literacy programs, and so on. And within 10 years, they had cut the achievement gap in half and moved the state to the very top of the nation. So there are ways to address these issues if you get serious about it. And I taught in Camden years ago. I lived in Philly and New York. I never would have expected them to set the pace. Now there's a governor there who is trying to undo all of those reforms, and we will see whether it survives or not. Last point. For whatever country you're in and wherever you're doing your work, this stuff is real hot potato stuff in terms of politics. The equity issues are so challenging and so difficult. So I know that if you're working on this, you feel like it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But I recall to mind frequently the words of Martin Luther King in 1968. Because he noted on some positions, cowardice asked the question, is it safe? Expediency asked the question, is it politic? Vanity comes along and asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when all of us must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. Thank you.